January 7th, 1945. The Ardennes, Belgium. The snow is no longer white. It is a churned slurry of mud, oil, and frozen blood. The artillery thunder that has shaken the forest for 3 weeks is finally beginning to fade, replaced by a biting silence that freezes the breath in your lungs. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble, is effectively over. The German panzers are burning out, their fuel tanks dry, their crews surrendering in droves to the shivering American GIs who have held the line. But 40 miles away, in the warmth of a commandeered operations room in Zonhoven, a different kind of explosion is about to take place. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, wearing his trademark beret and an expression of supreme confidence, walks into a room packed with war correspondents. There is no grand map on the wall, only the air of a man who believes he has single-handedly saved the Allied cause. He clears his throat, unaware that the words he is about to speak will inflict more damage on the coalition than 3 SS Panzer armies combined. He leans into the microphone, ready to claim a victory that was never truly his to claim. To understand the magnitude of the political disaster that erupted in January 1945, one must first revisit the military disaster that preceded it. 3 weeks prior to Montgomery's press conference, the Allied front line was a very different place. It is December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes sector, a 75-mile stretch of dense pine forest and rolling hills along the Belgian-German border, is quiet. American commanders call it the Ghost Front. It is used as a nursery for green divisions arriving from the States and a retirement home for battered units recovering from the Hurtgen forest. The prevailing wisdom at Supreme Headquarters is absolute. The German army is finished, incapable of mounting any offensive operations, let alone a counterattack through such difficult, tank-restricting terrain. At 5:30 that morning, the illusion of safety vanishes under the concentrated fire of 2,000 German artillery pieces. The barrage is so intense it shatters the tree line, sending razor-sharp splinters of pine raining down on the sleeping GIs in their foxholes. Before the smoke clears, the rumble of engines shakes the frozen ground. Through the heavy, freezing mist, weather specifically waited for by Adolf Hitler to ground the superior Allied Air Force, emerged the jagged silhouettes of King Tiger and Panther tanks. This is Operation Watch on the Rhine. Hitler's fanatical attempt to split the Allied armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. The shock is total. The American 106th Infantry Division, fresh in the line, finds itself engulfed by the 6th Panzer Army in hours. Communications wires are cut by German commandos disguised in American uniforms. Confusion reigns supreme. In the initial 48 hours, there is no cohesive front line, only isolated pockets of desperate resistance fighting in a sea of field grey. General Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group from the Hotel Alpha in Luxembourg City, initially dismisses the reports as a local spoiling attack. He is wrong. 3 German armies, over 400,000 men and 1,400 tanks are pouring through the gap. By December 19th, the scope of the catastrophe is undeniable. The German wedge drives deep into Belgium, creating a physical bulge in the maps at headquarters. This protrusion does more than just capture territory. It severs the nervous system of the American command structure. General Bradley is located south of the Bulge in Luxembourg. However, the bulk of the fighting and the majority of his troops, the U.S. 1st Army under Courtney Hodges and the U.S. 9th Army under William Simpson, are located on the northern shoulder of the German penetration. The telephone lines connecting Bradley to his northern armies are severed. Couriers are being ambushed on the snow-covered roads. The 1st Army HQ in Spa is threatened with overrun, forcing a hasty evacuation. The northern shoulder is holding, particularly at the critical Elsenborn Ridge, where American soldiers refuse to yield an inch, but the command structure is fracturing. The German offensive has physically isolated Bradley from his own men. The Allied line is no longer a continuous chain. It is broken in half, and the gap is widening by the hour. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, watching the maps at Versailles, recognizes a tactical necessity that will soon curdle into a political nightmare. He sees that Bradley can no longer effectively control the battle on the northern side of the Bulge. The communications are gone, and the distance is too great. The only Allied commander with a headquarters close enough and a communications network intact enough to coordinate the northern defense is the man commanding the British 21st Army Group, positioned just north of the American sector. Eisenhower prepares to make a decision based purely on military logic, ignoring the volatile personalities involved. He decides to take the American 1st and 9th Armies, the vast majority of American combat power in the region, and strip them from Omar Bradley's command. He intends to place them under the temporary operational control of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. It is a move dictated by the geography of the battlefield, but in the highly charged atmosphere of coalition's warfare, it looks perilously like a vote of no confidence in the American commanders. December 20th, 1944. The phone rings in General Omar Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg. On the other end is General Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff. The order is given, and the receiver feels heavy in Bradley's hand. The decision has been made. Command of the 1st and 9th U.S. Armies is officially transferred to Field Marshal Montgomery. In an instant, Omar Bradley, the GI's general, loses command of nearly 500,000 of his own men. He is left commanding only the southern flank, while the British Field Marshal takes the reins of the primary American fighting force in Europe. The reaction among the American officer corps is visceral. When General George S. Patton hears the news, his response is characteristic and unprintable, declaring that he would rather be commanded by anyone else on earth than the British Field Marshal. Bradley, a man known for his calm demeanor, is pushed to the brink of resignation. He sees this not as a tactical adjustment, but as a public humiliation, a signal to the world that American leadership has failed, and the British have been called in to clean up the mess. But up north, oblivious to the simmering American resentment, Montgomery wastes no time. He treats the assignment with the clinical detachment of a surgeon entering a chaotic operating theater. He arrives at the headquarters of the U.S. 1st Army, striding into the map room with an air of supreme authority. To the exhausted American staff officers, who have been awake for days managing a crisis, Montgomery's arrival is jarring. He immediately orders a halt to the piecemeal American counterattacks. He looks at the maps and sees disorder. He wants control. Montgomery's doctrine is one of balance, preparation, and tidying up the battlefield. He orders the American troops to withdraw from exposed positions to shorten their lines, a move that makes tactical sense but is anathema to American commanders who believe in holding every yard of ground paid for in blood. He brings order, certainly. He positions his own British XXX Corps as a backstop behind the Meuse River, a final insurance policy in case the Americans break. However, the friction begins immediately. Montgomery speaks to the American generals, Courtney Hodges and William Simpson, not as partners, but as pupils. He rejects their plans for immediate counterstrikes, insisting on waiting until the German offensive has fully culminated. While his caution is arguably sound strategy, his manner is insufferable. He walks among the Americans like a headmaster, disciplining unruly schoolboys. As Christmas approaches, the weather clears. The Allied air forces return to the skies, pulverizing the German supply lines. Patton's Third Army strikes from the south, breaking the siege of Bastogne on December 26th. The German offensive stalls, choked by a lack of fuel and the stubborn resistance of isolated American units like the 101st Airborne and the 7th Armored Division. The crisis passes. The Bulge is being flattened. By early January, the panic has subsided. The battle is technically won, but in the vacuum left by the receding German threat, a new conflict rushes in. The narrative of how the battle was won is now up for grabs. On the ground, the American soldier knows the truth. This was an American battle, fought with American equipment, resulting in over 75,000 American casualties. The British contribution, while helpful on the flanks, was numerically minor. Yet, in Montgomery's mind, a different story has crystallized. He looks at the maps and sees his own genius reflected back. He believes that his arrival on December 20th was the turning point. He believes his tidying up saved the First Army from annihilation. And now, with the microphone set up in Zonhoven, he is preparing to tell the world his version of the story. He is about to strike a match in a room filled with gasoline. To fully grasp why Montgomery's press conference became a diplomatic grenade, one must look away from the maps and into the minds of the men tracing the lines upon them. The conflict in the Ardennes was not just a collision of armies. It was a violent friction between two diametrically opposed philosophies of war, personified by two men who could barely stand to be in the same room. Field Marshal Montgomery is a man of ascetic discipline. He does not drink. He does not smoke. He goes to bed at 9:30 p.m. sharp, regardless of the crisis at hand. In his mobile tactical headquarters, a caravan he famously travels with, everything is meticulous. He views war as a mathematical equation to be solved with preparation and caution. To him, the American approach to battle is terrifyingly chaotic. He sees Eisenhower as a nice chap, but a political amateur, and Bradley as a competent subordinate who lacks the grip to control a massive front. Montgomery believes in centralized control, where a single mind, his mind, moves the pieces. When he looks at the American lines in December, he does not see flexibility. He sees a mess. He sees a disorganized rabble that invited the German attack through sheer negligence. Contrast this with General Omar Bradley. They call him the GI's general. He wears spectacles and looks more like a high school principal than a conqueror. He is quiet, unassuming, and fiercely protective of his men. Bradley fights a democratic war. He trusts his core commanders, men like Lightning Joe Collins and Courtney Hodges, to make decisions on the fly. He believes the American soldier fights best when given the initiative, not when treated like a cog in a British machine. For Bradley, the transfer of his armies to Montgomery is not just a command change. It is a personal violation. He sits in his headquarters in Luxembourg, chain-smoking, watching the snow fall. He knows his men are dying by the thousands to hold the line at Saint-Vith and Bastogne. To have Montgomery sweep in and treat them like incompetent children is a bitterness he cannot swallow. While the generals fume in private, a second battle is raging in the printing presses of London and Washington. The Allied coalition is held together by a fragile public sentiment, and by January 1945, that sentiment is fraying. In London, the newspapers are starving for a British victory. The war has dragged on for 5 years. The British public is exhausted, rationed, and battered by V-2 rockets. They see the map of Europe dominated by American manpower and American money. There is a deep national insecurity that the British Empire is being sidelined in its own war. So, when news breaks that Montgomery has been given command of the northern sector, the British press seizes upon it with ravenous hunger. The Daily Mail and the Times run headlines implying that Montgomery has been called in to save the floundering Americans. The narrative is set. The Yanks panicked, and the steady hand of Britain took the wheel. Across the Atlantic, the mood is venomous. The American press is reading the casualty reports. They know that for every British soldier bleeding in the Ardennes, there are 40 Americans. They see the Battle of the Bulge not as an American failure, but as an American heroism, an epic stand by the 101st Airborne and the shattered remnants of the 106th. To read British editorials claiming credit for stopping the rot enrages Washington. General Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, warns Eisenhower that if Montgomery is not reined in, the American public might demand a separate command structure entirely. The atmosphere is toxic. The alliance is not a monolith. It is a pressure cooker. And into this superheated environment steps Montgomery, holding a microphone, seemingly oblivious that he is about to confirm every worst suspicion the Americans hold. He is not just speaking to journalists, he is speaking into a canyon of national pride, and the echo will be deafening. While the newspapers argue over credit, and the generals nurse their bruised egos, a very different reality exists on the ground. One that makes the coming political explosion inevitable. The disconnect between Montgomery's sterile headquarters and the frozen hell of the Ardennes is absolute. Montgomery views the battle through the lens of a tidy up. In his mind, the stabilization of the northern flank is a result of his prudent orders to withdraw, to shorten the lines, to refuse premature counter-attacks. He sees the battle as a chess master sees a board, a series of logical moves to neutralize a threat. He believes his decision to bring the British XXX Corps to the Meuse River provided the crucial backstop that allowed the Americans to regroup. To him, this is a victory of British doctrine over American chaos. But to the men of the U.S. First Army, there is nothing tidy about the last 3 weeks. They have not been tidying up. They have been fighting for their lives in conditions that defy description. At the Elsenborn Ridge, the Little Dunkirk, as some call it, soldiers from the U.S. 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions are not withdrawing. They are digging into the frozen earth, often with their bare hands and bayonets, because their entrenching tools have snapped in the cold. They are holding the critical northern shoulder not because of a strategic directive from a British field marshal, but because of stubborn, localized grit. They are stopping the 12th SS Panzer Division, the elite of the German army, dead in his tracks with artillery, bazookas, and sheer volume of fire. Consider the defense of St. Vith. Here, the U.S. 7th Armored Division holds a vital road junction for days against overwhelming odds. They are surrounded, hammered by artillery, and cut off from supply. Their stand delays the entire German timeline, forcing the panzers into a traffic jam that stretches for miles. This action, which arguably saves the entire Allied position, takes place before Montgomery's command has fully solidified. The Americans feel they have stopped the German beast themselves. bleeding into the white snow to buy time for the rest of the army. This is the core of the coming crisis. It is a clash between the theoretical battle Montgomery believes he is managing and the visceral battle the Americans are fighting. Montgomery sees the American retreat from St. Vith, which he ordered, as a brilliant maneuver to consolidate the line. The American commanders see it as a heartbreaking surrender of ground they had successfully defended. Montgomery sees the arrival of his British reserves as the decisive factor. The Americans see the British sitting safely behind the river, while the GIs do the killing and the dying forward of the Meuse. The disparity in casualties tells the grim truth. By the time the battle winds down, the Americans will suffer nearly 80,000 casualties. The British, protecting the flanks and the rear, will suffer fewer than 1,500. To the American soldier shivering in a foxhole near Malmedy, seeing a British field marshal claim credit for handling the battle is not just a difference of opinion. It is a theft of their sacrifice. It is against this backdrop of frozen corpses, exhausted men, and national resentment that Montgomery decides the time is right to address the world. He believes he is about to clarify the situation, to explain how his superior generalship saved the day. He does not realize he is walking into a trap of his own making. The stage is set in Zonhoven. The reporters are assembling. The microphones are live. January 7th, 1945. The operational headquarters of the 21st Army Group in Zonhoven. The room is cramped, filled with the haze of cigarette smoke and the smell of wet wool coats. Packed inside are dozens of war correspondents from the BBC, the New York Times, Reuters, and the Stars and Stripes. They have been summoned here by Field Marshal Montgomery himself. The invitation promised a briefing on the interesting situation in the Ardennes. At precisely the appointed hour, Montgomery enters. He is not wearing a formal uniform, but his iconic maroon paratrooper beret and a casual sweater. He is relaxed, almost cheerful. He declines to sit behind a desk, preferring to stand before them, hands clasped behind his back, rocking slightly on his heels. To the journalists, he does not look like a man who has just survived a desperate defensive battle. He looks like a man who has just solved a particularly clever riddle. He begins speaking, and the scribbling of pencils is the only sound in the room. His voice is clipped, precise, and utterly devoid of doubt. He starts by describing the German offensive as a full-out effort that has now been defeated. This is true, but then he pivots to the how. As soon as I saw what was happening, Montgomery says, his eyes scanning the room, I took certain steps to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river. He pauses for effect. I carried out certain movements so as to provide balanced dispositions to meet the threatened danger. The American reporters exchange glances. They know the reality. American GIs stopped the Germans at Elsenborn and Bastogne, often without any input from Montgomery. But the field marshal is just getting started. He leans in, his tone shifting to one of almost paternal benevolence. The national newspaper of the British people, he continues, has been saying some quite complimentary things about me. He smiles. I should like to say that I have never been more proud of the British soldier than I have been during the past few weeks. Then comes the fatal sentence. The sentence that will be transmitted to Washington and burn like acid. He describes the moment Eisenhower gave him command of the American armies. I was thinking about this the other day, he says. The battle has been most interesting. I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. He gestures with his hands, mimicking a man saving a helpless animal. When the situation began to deteriorate, General Eisenhower placed me in command of the whole northern front. I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies. This power was brought into play very gradually, and finally it was put into battle with a bang. The lie hangs in the air. The bang he refers to is the limited involvement of the British ex-Gek-Ex Corps, which, while valuable, was a fraction of the combat power the Americans had exerted. But Montgomery is not finished. He delivers the coup de grace. The Americans were in a fix, he implies, though not in those exact words, but the sentiment is clear. He describes the battle not as a desperate slugfest, but as a clean-up operation. I think, he says with a satisfied nod, that possibly I have plucked the cat from the bag. He praises the American soldier, calling them brave fighting men, but the praise lands with a sickening thud. It sounds like a master complimenting a servant. It sounds like a professional patting a talented amateur on the head. He concludes by saying, "It has been a proper Allied show." The press conference ends. Montgomery walks out, convinced he has just cemented the Allied bond by clarifying the chain of command. He believes he has been generous. But as the reporters rush to the telegraph operators, they know better. They know that when these words reach the headquarters of Omar Bradley and George Patton, they will not be read as an analysis of victory. They will be read as a declaration of war. The reaction is immediate and nuclear. When the transcripts of the press conference reach the Hotel Alpha in Luxembourg, General Omar Bradley is described by his staff as looking stricken. Bradley, a man who has endured the stress of command for months without breaking, is finally pushed past his limit. He reads the words, "Plucked the cat from the bag, interesting little battle," and feels a profound sense of betrayal. To him, Montgomery has not just insulted his command ability, he has trampled on the graves of the American dead. Bradley picks up the phone and calls Eisenhower. His voice is shaking. He issues an ultimatum that no supreme commander ever wants to hear. "Ike, I cannot serve under Montgomery. If he is to be given command of the ground forces, you must send me home." At the Third Army headquarters, General George S. Patton is even less diplomatic. Upon hearing the broadcast, he explodes. This is the last straw. He roars to his staff. "If Ike doesn't fire that son of a bitch, I'll resign my commission and join the Chinese army." The two most important American field commanders effectively go on strike against the British leadership. But the damage goes deeper than the generals. The German propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, intercepts the broadcast. They gleefully rebroadcast a distorted version of Montgomery's speech over the radio, specifically targeting American troops. The German narrator mocks the GIs. "You see? The British are laughing at you. You die, and they take the credit." It is a masterstroke of psychological warfare, turning an ally's arrogance into a weapon. American soldiers, shivering in their foxholes, listen to the radio and seethe. Reports of fistfights between American and British soldiers in rear areas begin to reach headquarters. In Versailles, Dwight D. Eisenhower realizes the coalition is facing its darkest hour. He has spent 2 years walking a tightrope, balancing national interests with military necessity, but the rope has finally snapped. He knows that he cannot lose Bradley and Patton. The American public would never forgive it, and the war effort would collapse. He is left with only one choice. Eisenhower sits at his desk and drafts the most significant letter of his career. It is not an order of battle. It is a resignation of the alliance. He writes to General George Marshall in Washington. The message is stark and final. It appears that the Prime Minister and I cannot work together. He outlines the situation and offers a binary choice to the combined Chiefs of Staff. It is either him, Eisenhower, or Montgomery. They cannot both remain in command. Eisenhower is fully prepared to fire Britain's most famous general. He summons his Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith. "Tell Monty," Eisenhower says, his voice cold, "that if he doesn't retract these statements, I will send this letter to Washington. And tell him that if I go, the American armies go with me." The message is clear. Eisenhower is putting the entire U.S. participation in the European theater on the table. This special relationship is about to be severed by a single press conference. Bedell Smith grabs his coat and heads for the airfield. He has 1 hour to fly to Montgomery's headquarters and stop the collapse of the Western Front, January 8, 1945, the headquarters of the 21st Army Group. The atmosphere inside Field Marshal Montgomery's tactical caravan is usually one of quiet, disciplined efficiency. But today the air is thick with a different kind of tension. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, a man known for his ulcers and his short temper, steps out of his staff car. He has not come for a strategy session. He has come to deliver an execution order. Bedell Smith finds Montgomery in a buoyant mood. The Field Marshal is still convinced that his press conference was a masterstroke of public relations, a necessary clarification that would soothe American anxieties. When Smith enters, Montgomery greets him warmly, perhaps expecting praise. Smith cuts him off. He does not sit down. He looks the Field Marshal in the eye and delivers the message with the blunt force of a sledgehammer. "If you don't retract what you said," Smith tells him, "General Eisenhower will send a cable to the combined Chiefs of Staff demanding that you be relieved of command. He will tell them it is either you or him." Montgomery is stunned. Witnesses describe the color draining from his face. For the first time in the war, the unshakable confidence that has defined his career evaporates. "Relieved," he stammers. "But I thought the press conference went rather well." Smith shakes his head. He explains that the American press is calling for Montgomery's head. He explains that Bradley is refusing to speak to him. He explains that Patton is threatening to resign. The alliance is not just strained, it is broken. And unless Montgomery fixes it immediately, Eisenhower, the man Montgomery privately considers an amateur, will destroy him. The reality of the situation crashes down on Montgomery. He realizes suddenly that despite his victories in North Africa, despite his popularity in London, he is mathematically expendable. The United States is providing 3/4 of the men, tanks, and money for the final drive into Germany. In a contest between the British Field Marshal and the American Supreme Commander, there is only one winner. Montgomery, for all his arrogance, is a soldier. He knows when a position is untenable. He knows when he is outflanked. He swallows his pride, a pill more bitter than any defeat on the battlefield, and asks for a pen. He sits at his small desk and writes a letter to Eisenhower. It is a letter of total capitulation. "Dear Ike," he writes, "I am distressed that my press conference has caused so much trouble. I would like to say that I am absolutely devoted to you and will do everything I can to help you." He signs it, "Your very devoted subordinate, Monty." The letter is dispatched immediately. When Eisenhower receives it, his anger cools. He is a pragmatic man. He does not want to fire Montgomery. He needs Montgomery's tactical brain for the crossing of the Rhine. He accepts the apology. The crisis in the command tent is averted. But while the generals have made peace, the public damage cannot be undone with a private letter. The newspapers are already on the streets. The headlines in the Daily Mail scream, "Monty leads American armies to victory." The headlines in the Washington Post scream betrayal. The American public is furious, believing their boys are dying only for a British general to steal the glory. The rift between the two nations is widening, and the Germans are watching, waiting for the coalition to tear itself apart. A private apology is not enough. The situation requires a public act of contrition, a voice loud enough to drown out the press and authoritative enough to silence the critics. There is only one man in the Western world capable of such a feat. In London, Winston Churchill is watching the disaster unfold. He knows that if he does not act, the special relationship might not survive the winter. He prepares to do something he hates. He prepares to humble his own general to save the American alliance. January 18th, 1945. The House of Commons, London. The chamber is packed. The air is heavy with the scent of damp wool and old wood, but heavier still with the weight of expectation. The members of Parliament sit shoulder to shoulder on the green leather benches. They know the rumors. They know Washington is furious. They know the alliance that is currently crushing the Third Reich is suffering a fracture that could derail the end of the war. Winston Churchill rises from his seat. He looks older now than he did in 1940. The war has carved deep lines into his face, and his shoulders are stooped under the burden of 5 years of conflict. But as he steps to the dispatch box, the old fire returns to his eyes. He adjusts his glasses and looks out at the assembly. He knows that his next words will be broadcast across the Atlantic. He knows that he is not just speaking to the British people. He is speaking directly to the American soldier shivering in the Ardennes and to the angry generals in the Pentagon. He begins by addressing the elephant in the room, the Battle of the Bulge. He does not equivocate. He does not offer vague diplomatic platitudes. He goes straight for the truth, dismantling the narrative that his own field marshal had so carelessly constructed. "I have seen it suggested," Churchill growls, his voice resonating through the chamber, "that the British armies played the majestic part in this struggle." He pauses, letting the silence hang heavy. That is not true. A ripple of shock moved through the back benches. Churchill continues, his voice rising with emotion. "Care must be taken in telling our proud tale not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." He proceeds to lay out the cold, hard numbers, the very numbers Montgomery had glossed over. He reminds the world that for every British soldier in the line, there were 30 Americans. He speaks of the losses, the 60 to 80 American divisions pouring across the Atlantic, the sheer industrial and human cost paid by the United States. He credits General Eisenhower, not Montgomery, with the strategic vision that held the line. "The United States troops have done almost all the fighting," he declares, "and have suffered almost all the losses." It is a stunning moment of political humility. The Prime Minister of Great Britain stands before his own government and publicly subordinates his nation's military contribution to that of his ally. He effectively rebukes his most successful general to soothe the wounded pride of the Americans. The effect is instantaneous. When the speech is broadcast in the United States, the headlines change overnight. The New York Times prints the speech in full. General Marshall in Washington sends a telegram to Churchill, thanking him for his generous statement. In the muddy headquarters of the 12th Army Group, Omar Bradley reads the transcript and nods. The tension breaks. The anger dissipates. Churchill has done what Montgomery could not. He has used words not to claim glory, but to heal a wound. He has saved the coalition. The special relationship is battered, and the balance of power has irrevocably shifted from London to Washington, but it holds. The armies turn their eyes back to the east, where the Rhine River waits. The political battle is over. The final destruction of Nazi Germany can resume. History is often written in blood, but as the events of January 1945 demonstrate, it can nearly be unwritten by a few careless sentences. The Battle of the Bulge was the Third Reich's final desperate gasp, a massive expenditure of steel and lives that failed to turn the tide of the war. But the crisis that followed in the command tents of Zonhoven revealed a fragility in the Allied coalition that no German panzer division could ever exploit. The Battle of the Press Conference serves as a stark reminder that in coalition warfare, the greatest danger often lies not across the trenches, but across the conference table. Field Marshal Montgomery, a man of undeniable brilliance on the battlefield, failed to understand that victory is not just a matter of logistics and tactics. It is a matter of human relationships. His inability to see past his own reflection nearly shattered the alliance on the eve of its greatest triumph. Ultimately, this moment marked a definitive turning point in the geopolitics of the 20th century. When Winston Churchill stood in the House of Commons and publicly humbled his own military to salute the American flag, he was doing more than just soothing a diplomatic row. He was acknowledging a passing of the torch. The era of the British Empire as the dominant global force was ending, fading into the snows of the Ardennes, replaced by the rising industrial and military titan of the United States. It took the wisdom of a statesman to save the soldiers from their own generals. Churchill understood what Montgomery did not, that to win the war, Britain had to be willing to lose the argument. The alliance held, the Rhine was crossed, and the Nazi regime was destroyed. But for one freezing week in January, the fate of the free world hung by a thread, threatened not by the enemy's guns, but by an ally's vanity.